Hi, I'm Megan Hyatt Miller, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. It's me, Mike Vardy, and I'm joined on this particular episode by Megan Hyatt Miller. She is the co-author of Mind Your Mindset, the science that shows success starts with your thinking. And Megan is the president and chief executive officer of Full Focus. She's the co-host of the popular business podcast Lead to Win, and she's also the co-author of Win at Work and Succeed at Life. I've had a chance to meet Megan before in person back a few years ago when I was down in Franklin, Tennessee, which is where their offices are located. Of course, her father, Michael Hyatt, has been on the program before. You'll find links to his episodes in the show notes, but we talk about probably one of the most challenging things that we need to do to improve our relationship with time and cultivate productiveness and improve balance in our lives. And that's minding our mindset. We talk about the 3 I's. We talk about the West Wing, because that comes up. And we talk about the idea of reason, intuition, so much more. Let's get to this conversation. Here's my chat with Megan Hyatt Miller. Enjoy. Megan, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I think this is the first time ever that we've had a generational guest on the podcast before, unless my daughter counts. But I mean, I don't know how that works. She does.
Listen, daughters count.
No, I know. But the thing is, she's not as interested in the work that I do as much as you and your father, Michael Hyatt, who has been on the show before. We'll link it in the show notes. It's fascinating to me that when I look at this book, Mind Your Mindset, the science that shows success starts with your thinking, is a book that you wrote together. So I'm going to get right out of the gate. What was that process like?
Well, in a way, it's kind of like everything else we do. We are just having, in your language, lots of productive conversations all the time about all kinds of things. And mindset has been one of those topics that's just perennial for us, that is always coming around and always kind of in the ether of what we're discussing. And as we thought about this book and we thought about writing together again, we have another book called Win at Work and Succeed at Life that we did together about work-life balance. That's really great. But, we just thought this is really the prequel to all the work that he's done, that we've done together, that we're doing now through Full Focus, our company. And so it was a really fun process to see how we got to this topic of mindset through our own unique stories, but in the end, they led to the same place. So I think it's helpful for people to hear from 2 different generations, 2 different seasons of life and careers and families and all those things. He's kind of the sage. I'm kind of like in the trenches of life. And so it was a lot of fun, as it is for all the things we do together.
It's interesting because you brought up like the prequel. It seems to me, and we're all kind of living in the same sphere, that the mindset piece is the hardest nut to crack. Like it really is.
It's the hardest nut to crack, and it's the most important because, as we kind of thought about the work that we've done a lot of work around productivity, a lot of work around leadership and goal setting and goal achievement, more importantly. What really gets in the way for people is not the tactical stuff or even the strategic stuff. What usually is in the way is the stuff we're most unaware of, which is what's happening between our ears. And it's also the greatest potential to unlock our success. So it is the hardest, but it's also the most exciting from our perspective, because it's the thing that most people really haven't done a lot of work on. And gosh, if you can figure this out, the future just breaks wide open.
One question that I have as I was going through the book was, and I'm not saying that it's not a tough read, but what it is you're asking people to go deeply into an area that is, and you even say, like, unsettling as it may be, uncertainty is not the enemy. It points not to chaos, but to possibility. That's right out of the gate. And it's almost like a harbinger of like, okay, listen, like what we're about to talk about here and write about here is stuff that you might get a little, there's uncertainty, but you might get uncomfortable. So if someone's going through the book and, what are some of the things that you can say to them that will help them kind of push through that unsettling feeling that you get when you realize that, oh, this is not a one and done proposition. This is something that I have to mind.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think a lot of us in the last few years have felt a profound lack of control. I think in some ways that's why the work that we do around productivity and the work that you do in that space as well has been as successful as it's been, because people want to recapture a sense of control over their lives. And there's been all these things happening that are outside of our control. And that's not a good feeling, And so I think that what I would say is, certainly as you experience and as you step into this world of mindset and you really begin to examine your thinking and how it's driving the actions you're taking and therefore predictive of the results you're getting, it's kind of a good news, bad news thing, because on the one hand, it's going to require some work. On the other hand, it's going to put you in the driver's seat in your life in a way that you didn't even know you could be in the driver's seat. In so many cases, I certainly didn't years ago when I started really learning about this and putting it into practice. There's just so much to be empowered in this world of mindset that not only can this positively affect your own life and, as we talk about in the book, the results you're getting, but it can also help you if you're a parent, if you're a spouse, if you're a leader, if you're a professional, whatever your context is. And probably for a lot of us, it's a lot of overlapping roles. There's a lot of application beyond ourselves that we can help other people too, which is exciting to me.
Let's talk about the 3 I's, because that's kind of the framing that is used for the book. So can we go through, and the way, anyone who's listened to the show before knows that, I don't necessarily go in sequential order, but I think that for the, as you go through this, those 3 I's, they almost initially have to be done in sequential order. And then after that, it's very much a kind of checkpoint thing, right?
Yeah. So we talk about in the book that there are really 3 steps to minding your mindset. And the first is to identify the stories that you're telling yourself. What is the story in your head? And I'll pause there for just a second, because this is a concept that may be brand new to you if you're listening. Most of us don't realize that the thoughts in our head are actually a narrative that our brain is feeding us. And we talk about in the book this idea, there's what happens to us, the facts of our life, things that could be empirically verified, they're observable, measurable. They would be in a police report or a medical report or something like that. And then our brain, because it's a sense-making machine, is going to layer on top of that what that means. And that's the story or the narrative. And typically we kind of conflate those things and we assume that they're one thing, or that the facts are the story. And in fact, that's not the truth. The story is a subjective interpretation of the facts that our brain gives us, because our brain likes to make meaning and it wants to help keep us safe and out of danger. And so those stories can tend to be self-protective and even negative oftentimes at their first pass. So the first thing we want to do is we want to identify, okay, what stories are we telling? And you don't really need to mess with the ones that aren't causing any trouble, but let's say you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, and no matter how hard you try, you always quit or give up, or no matter how hard you try, you just can't make progress. Or maybe you have a difficult relationship or something that you want to happen in your professional life and you feel stuck. That's where you want to look. Okay, what am I saying in my head? What is that little voice in my head? We call it the narrator in the book. What is he or she saying to me? And once you do that, you can go into step 2, which is to interrogate the story.
Right.
And this is the step where we really are trying to separate the fact from the fiction, if you will. Those observable facts that anybody off the street could observe and agree on versus the interpretation of the facts, that story that we're telling. And part of what we're trying to do is prep our brain for this idea that there might be another interpretation. The reason that matters is because the stories that we tell ourselves really pre-program our brain to look for certain kinds of solutions, answers to our questions and so forth that lead to the actions we take. And the actions we take lead to the results we're getting. Most of us were trained just to do something different if we don't like the results we're getting, or try harder or something like that. But in fact, we need to go further upstream and we need to look at the story that is informing the actions that we take and really kind of prejudicing us on, towards certain actions and not toward others if we want to get different results. So we've got to, first of all, we've got to identify the story. Then we've got to interrogate it and separate what's the story I'm telling from the actual raw facts. And then we can move on to the third step, which is to imagine imagine a better story. Because if we really want better results, if we want something that we've never achieved before in our life or something that has eluded us in some way, we've got to go further upstream. We've got to tell the kind of story that's going to kind of tune our brain to look for the kinds of actions and solutions that will ultimately lead to that result. Because otherwise, we're just kind of trying that brute force method that we've all tried before of just try harder or just, keep doing more in the same vein that you're doing. And that's unlikely to lead to different results. So first of all, identify the story you're telling. Second of all, interrogate the story. And third, imagine a better story. And those are the three pretty simple steps, not necessarily easy, but three simple steps to minding your mindset.
That's the key. They're not necessarily easy,
right?
But they are simple. It's as you were talking about, especially as we go from, you're talking going further, digging deeper, going upstream. Mm-hmm. The thing that I circle back to is journaling, like this idea of and the difference between people who quote journal on social media for optics sake. Right. And then, because they're not going to, truth be told, that's part of the story in a lot of cases. Like you don't get to see the real underpinnings, but a journaling would allow you, to, provided that you're going to tell, be truthful. And because then you can, to me, it seems like starting that kind of habit would be beneficial now, even as you make your way through this book, because it helps to kind of either retell or properly tell the story, right?
Yeah. Well, and the most important thing you're actually doing when you're journaling is you're objectifying the story in your head. Like you're getting it out of your head where you can't really analyze it or do anything with it because it feels like it's just you. Like this is part of you. It's your truth. It is the truth. And when you get it out on paper, now you can see, one, is it working for me? And is there maybe another way I could interpret these events that would be more advantageous as I look toward getting different kind of results in my life and in whatever area? So, and for some people, the idea of journaling, they're like, oh gosh, not journaling. You can do this on a yellow legal pad. You can do it on the whiteboard in your office. You can do it on the notes app on your phone. Like we're not really picky about where you do it, but you need to literally write down those sentences in your head, which is how stories show up. They show up as these just kind of phrases or sentences in your head. We want to get those on paper, figuratively speaking, digitally or physically, so that we can then start to go through that process of interrogation and then imagine something better. I do this with my kids. I have 5 kids, and it is amazingly effective to kind of make it concrete in that way. And I don't think adults are a whole lot different.
No. One of the things that I caught as I was going through the book, it reminded me of an episode of The West Wing. When you
I love The West Wing.
But you remember the episode where CJ had to take a meeting with the people who were going to try to teach geography different in school, and they had the different map? Well, in the book, you talk about the idea of the first map of the United States that was drawn, right? Mm-hmm. And that brought me back to it. Like the idea of not only that map, but then when you think about that episode, and maybe we might be able to find a link on YouTube and put it in the show notes. If we can, we will. But because it's just a short clip, but the idea of when they looked what the world looked like based on what they were taught, the story versus, hey, this is what the world looks like. And the reason that these countries are portrayed as smaller, even though they're bigger, has a lot to do with socioeconomics. Like there was a lot of interesting things there. And I'm like, that, like the look on her face of her mind being blown seems to be the equivalent of when you finally figure out what that, the story that you've been saying is either wrong, and then you want to dig deeper. Is that the kind of thing that, like when you were doing this, as you were making your way through the book, and even as you were practicing this, was there a moment where, for you in particular, there was an aha moment where like, wait a minute, if this is wrong, or if this is untrue, or slightly inaccurate, or let's say shaped in a way that favors me as opposed to being real, I wonder what else is. Do you have a quintessential moment where that triggered?
Well, I tell a story at the beginning of the book, which was really my kind of light bulb moment with regard to mindset. And it comes back to one of the greatest fears that almost all humans have, which is public speaking. And I am no different. I had a debilitating fear of public speaking my entire life. It started in high school when I watched a friend become overwhelmed at giving a presentation. She ran out, kind of had an anxiety attack, and I found her in the bathroom crying, just in humiliation. And unbeknownst to me, my brain is like, okay, girl on the floor of the bathroom crying after having tried to give a presentation. What does this mean? My brain came up with a story that said speaking is dangerous and it could lead to certain humiliation and you could lose control of your body. It would be awful. So you should just never do it, under any circumstances. Well, fast forward to my life, I didn't even know that story was running around in my head. It just felt true, like it just felt like anybody would think that was true. And it's not actually true at all. It's just a subjective interpretation. I shut myself out of so many professional opportunities that would require me to speak. And it got so bad that even sitting like in a book club, I couldn't read a passage in a book out loud with like 6 or 8 people because the sound of my own voice felt so threatening. I mean, it was just, it became totally irrational. And so fast forward, here I am, I'm leading this company now with my dad. I'm the COO at that time. And my team came to me and they said, hey, we want to do a big live event for our audience. It's going to be amazing. And we just realized the funniest thing, you've never keynoted for us. And so we thought, we'll have you keynote at this event. It's going to be like 800 people. Doesn't that sound amazing? And I'm thinking inside, this is my literal worst nightmare, like I'm going to actually die.
Right.
And of course, I had to reluctantly say yes because it was that or like be exposed. By the way, nobody knew about this except my husband.
And by the way, this is not that long ago either of this recording.
No.
You've not. It's not like this is happening like a decade or like this is not a terribly long time ago.
This is like 5 years ago,
Yeah.
I think, at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this, it's kind of embarrassing to tell in a way because, it's like so out of alignment with the rest of my career and everything else. But I had this just debilitating fear. And this is one of those things to note. Sometimes these areas, they get kind of layered with shame and humiliation and embarrassment, and then they just get more and more powerful. Well, I had a real choice to make at that moment. Am I going to basically walk away from my career? Because you can't become the CEO of a company and not be willing to speak in front of people. Like they're just, those things don't go together. Or am I going to finally face this fear? And I just thought, you know what? This story feels outdated to me. I wouldn't have even had totally that language at that point, but I don't want to be confined anymore. I feel like I'm in a small story. I don't want to do that. So I hired a speech coach. I hired a life coach. I mean, I got medicine from a doctor, an anxiety coach. I mean, everybody I could get to help me. And I went on a 6-week period of time, like an intensive period of time where not only was I preparing for that keynote, but I was really like doing battle with this story that speaking would kill me. I mean, that's what I thought, that ultimately it was that threatening. And it was a really hard 6 weeks to go through the process of identifying and interrogating that story. But I actually wrote a story about what it would be like to step on stage, how I would feel. And it wasn't some like woo-woo affirmation about like, I'm now a TEDx speaker and I'm the best speaker in the world. It was like, I'm able to connect with my audience, what my voice matters. I'm able to stand in my physical presence and like fill up the stage, with confidence, those kinds of things. And when I got on stage, by the way, I had a panic attack the day before the speaking engagement on the way home from sound check. So, I mean, I just want to like keep it real. It was challenging, but it played out exactly like I had written it. The news story caused me to look for different kinds of solutions and take different actions, which ultimately led to different results. And I've gone on to speak a ton since then. Almost every week I'm doing something like that, not to mention things like this, like interviews. And I was really able to overcome that because I learned to tell a new story. And that for me was the impetus for this book. And that's what I want for others. Hopefully you don't have such a dramatic story that you need help with, but you might. And if you do, that's okay, because this is a really effective process.
I also wonder if sometimes, and this is the way the brain loves to work, is it's sometimes not those big grand things that are the story. Right. Like it's those little, like you talked about layers, but sometimes it's just like a little untruth that is like almost like a tripwire, right?
Right.
And I imagine the listener right now going, okay, but I'm not this, but there's probably something. that, like, so don't just think about the grand gestures, right? Those grand things. I mean, I would imagine that's where we get tripped up a lot, right? Is because it's like big, big, big. And they're like, wait a minute, hold on. And this is the interrogation piece, right? Like, an interrogation isn't like a one and done, again, like asking one big question. You're drilling and drilling and drilling, right?
Right. Like, would someone else see it the same way? How else could I interpret that? What would some other options be? You can even ask people if, when presented with this list of facts, what would you think? And normally when I go through this exercise, I either do it on a whiteboard or a piece of paper, and I will make 2 columns. On one column, I will write down the facts. And I'm talking like, these are things like, at 6 p.m., the guy crossed the street, like just boring facts that would be in a medical report or a police report or something like that. And then I'm writing down on the right side of the paper in the other column what I'm saying about those facts. Things like, and he looked like he was going to go rob a bank, or, and he looked like he was in a hurry because he was late for a meeting, or, and he looked like he was having a medical emergency. Those are subjective interpretations of the guy walking across the street. And what you realize is there are as many interpretations as there are neurons in your brain, which are like trillions. I mean, it's just endless. And our brain likes to think that there's just one interpretation and that's the truth. But what we talk about in the book is the brain likes certainty so much that it would rather have the wrong answer than have no answer.
Right.
And so the more complex the situation is, the higher the stakes are, the more likely you're going to be to have some real certain answer. I mean, we see this in politics all the time. It's got to be like this, And in reality, like, who knows? Like, we don't necessarily know, or it would take longer to get to a really good answer. But our brain would rather have the wrong answer than no answer. And I think that is such a helpful thing to know about how we're wired.
It's so funny because, I mean, this is not the first time this has come up, but this idea that nothing is black and white. Like, there is so much gray, so much nuance.
Yes.
That I have to ask, writing this book now, you've written another book with your dad, and also your company, all that stuff, like the amount of nuance. This is a big challenge it seems like that. I mean, as much as it's a prequel, it does seem like the natural progression of the work because it's the only, you only get there by doing the tactical and all that. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait. We need the cart before the horse, sort of. But what's interesting to me is that people would much rather pick up the full focus planner and work through like the tactical step by step than do this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think you bring this up in the book, this quote, because I love the idea of reason. Because reason to me is the middle. So if logic is one side of the spectrum and emotion is the other, reason is kind of like this weird balance. It's not 100%. It's anything in between. Sometimes it's mixed with a bit more logic, but it takes into account both. And what you say here, which I loved, is reason and intuition are both needed for understanding, and your brain makes use of both. So can we touch on that in terms of this, especially the concept, because the interrogate piece in this book, and rightfully so to me, seems like it's the densest, not necessarily the longest, but the one where you're like, keep going. And I'm not trying to say that it's tough to read. It's the reader's interpretation. Here we go. of that, of like, oh, it's like this, it can be a slog because there's a lot that you need to unpack, right?
Well, I mean, I think that's where the work is. That's where the work is in minding your mindset. That's where the work is in really getting a handle on this lever of success, being able to use your mindset to unlock greater levels of success for yourself or productivity or whatever it is that you're after in your life. The mindset is probably the missing piece, but the identifying the story part and then imagining a better story, those kind of bookends of this 3-step process, those are really the easy part, because once you get good at and by good, I just mean this is a skill. This is not a talent. This is a skill. You can absolutely develop it. Nobody is innately amazing at this. It's all something we learn. But getting to the place where you've practiced enough that you're like, oh, I'm telling myself a story, like here's what the story is. That becomes second nature after a while. And then even getting to the place where you can imagine something that is, more empowering, that's going to lead you to the kind of actions that will get you the kind of results you want. That's not too difficult. The interrogation part is the most difficult because because it involves uncertainty, which again, your brain just doesn't like. It wants to hang on to that story because that gives it certainty, which for your brain is its number one priority. For you, it's not, because you know that everything that's good in your life is probably on the other side of your comfort zone. If you think of anything in your life that has been positive, whether it's something you've achieved or a relationship that really matters to you or whatever, it's probably on the other side of your comfort zone. And the only way you go through that is through uncertainty. And so just to realize that that's what's happening there is you're basically unraveling the certainty of your facts and your story being fused together. You're unfusing them and you're using things like your intuition, you're using things like your reason to interrogate them, those stories that you have, so that ultimately you can get to the place where you can imagine something better. I think it's an important point to say that this part is the most challenging because there's a lot of conversation out there, particularly like in the self-help space, of this idea of affirmations, like where you basically you realize that maybe you're not even totally conscious of a story you're telling, but you know where you want to go. You want something in your health, let's say, and or financially, and you just start trying to manifest that by talking about this story or a line that is grandiose in some way. The problem is it doesn't work because your brain basically calls BS on that new story if you haven't gone through the process of interrogating it, because it's like, wait a second. That's my certainty. That's what I know to be true. You've got to do the work of kind of like unraveling it before it's willing to accept a different kind of story. So it's important.
Well, and then once you get through that phase, and like you said, it's a skill that you really need to revisit again. And once you get to the idea of imagining, then the uncertainty can come back in, right? Like that's where you're okay with it. There's a part of the book where you talk about looking for novelty, right? Like the idea, and there's a chart in here about the number of ideas you have, length of time, things like that, which is interesting because I have tons of ideas, and anybody who's a creative and slash or an entrepreneur, tons of ideas. Doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to be things that you bring to fruition, but you get more Again, we talked about this right off the top. With me being this far ahead because we're recording this just to be completely transparent. March 1st is when this is recorded. This episode did not come out until May. So we're 60 days ahead.
So impressive.
But again, it's that idea of I wanted to get far enough ahead so I could deal with other things in a more competent manner. But the tricky part, and this is why it's not a one and done, is I need to figure out what that line is of, okay, this is how far ahead I should be. Because again, that level of competence, all those C words, confidence, competence, and comfort can turn into complacency if you don't. And the thing about, as I was going through the book, was the battle that you go through when you're going through that interrogation process is so hard at first. Like it really is, because it really wants to, like you said, hold on to that level of certainty. But once you make it past that point, like you talked about the public speaking, whatever it is for the person listening right now, it then unlocks a whole bunch of stuff, right? Can we talk about that unlocking of the ability to do things that might be outside of your comfort zone, that aren't spontaneous and even have a level of novelty, which seems incongruent to the idea of I need everything certain. Well, if novelty is rarely has the only thing about certainty when it comes to novelty is that we crave that too, right?
Totally. And I do a lot of coaching work, both in our business and I lead coaches, but then I'm also a coach myself. And so I work with a lot of CEOs, a lot of business owners. And one of the things that I have observed is that success in large part is determined by your tolerance for discomfort. And again, this is not innate. This is actually something that we develop and build. So we can tolerate discomfort by putting ourselves in situations where we're uncomfortable, which is not super fun. But and so why would we do it? Well, why we would do it is because there's something we want more than being comfortable. There's something we want, again, in our relationships, in our financial life, in our health, in our work, that is worth somehow getting through discomfort to the other side of. And so if we're willing first of all, to be clear that we're always going to default to certainty and comfort, that's just kind of like from an evolutionary biology standpoint, that's what our brain likes. And that's kind of like, we're not quite caught up with the present, in terms of what we actually need to thrive today. But then if we know that, we can actually train ourselves, we can train our brain to become our ally instead of our enemy. Because you may be just thinking, gosh, what a pain in the rear end my brain can be. And it's like, yes. And we actually can train it. Like in our family, we're getting ready to get a new puppy. The puppy is right now at training in Indiana, and he'll come home in about 6 weeks. Hopefully fully trained. I've got 5 kids, so I'm not really into training dogs. I kind of want those to be plug and play. But it's interesting because that puppy showed up at training like just a little hot mess. I mean, all over the place, not great trained, not going to obey, all of that. And that puppy is going through a process of training, and our brain is actually no different. Our brain can be trained to, one, tolerate discomfort, to go through a process of interrogating the stories we tell, and then having the discipline to intentionally tell ourselves stories over and over and create those new neural pathways for the kind of stories that are going to lead us to actions that lead to results that are really what we want in our life and are really congruent with who we are and where we want to go.
Megan, this has been a fantastic conversation. I know we're going to have more in the future, but I'm going to let you go now. And what I'd like you to share before we wrap up is just one quick thing that someone could do today so that they could start to mind their mindset now.
Awesome. Totally. Okay. So the first thing that I want you to do is just get out a piece of paper or open up the Notes app on your phone and just think about something in your life that you're frustrated about, that you don't like the results you're getting, you're not happy with how it's going. And I want you to write down the sentence that is in your head, the kind of thing that keeps coming up. If you had a little neon sign, that was coming up in your head, and I want you to just write that down. And then I want you to go through the process of saying, okay, so what are the facts and what is the story I'm telling myself? And you're really trying to just pull those two things apart and then ask yourself, could there be another interpretation that might ultimately predispose my brain to look for actions that would lead to better results? And, you can do this in like 5 or 10 minutes in the car line at school, while you're eating lunch at your desk. You can do this really quickly. This is not like a deep, process that's going to take you hours and hours. You can just begin playing around with it, and it'll change your life if you do it.
Megan, the book is called Mind Your Mindset. You and your father, Michael Hyatt, put this together. Where can people pick up the book, and where can people keep up with the work that you're doing?
Thanks so much for asking. Well, you can pick up the book anywhere that you like to buy your books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, local booksellers, whatever. But I want to make sure that your listeners know that we've set up a special page with some special gifts for your audience, which is at mindyourmindsetbook.com/Vardy. And that is going to have some really cool things like a course that we recently recorded with some great implementation steps and kind of, workshopy. It's going to have an audiobook file there, and it's also going to have a self-coacher tool that's kind of like a Mad Libs for what I just talked you through. And so all you got to do is just take your receipt over there to get all those things, and you can find out more about us and what we're doing at Full Focus there as well. So mindyourmindsetbook.com/Vardy.
Awesome. And we'll make sure that we link that in the show notes. Megan, thanks so much for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thanks for having a conversation with me too.
Thanks to Megan for joining me for this particular conversation. You can find all of the links, everything you need at productivityist.com/podcast475. And if you want to help the show out, there's a couple of things you can do. Number one, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening to it right now. Just hit the subscribe button, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you. And that way you don't miss a single episode of what's to come. Plus, it's so much easier to go through archives of past episodes. The other thing you can do to support the show is check out the sponsors that we shared with you during this conversation. You can go to productivityist.com/podcast sponsors to learn more about them, and then let them know that we sent you. That's it for this episode. Until next time, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.